Hello again, and welcome to Transportation Planning for People and the Climate, hosted by the REAMP Network with an excellent set of partners, including APA Iowa, Thousand Friends of Iowa, Thousand Friends of Wisconsin, Transportation Writers United, and Move Minnesota, and featuring the REAMP Network. REAMP works across the Midwest. If we can advance our slide for a brief moment. The REAMP network has 140 organizations that are all working all across the Midwest with a shared goal of equitably eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from the Midwest by the year 2050. We really are focused on thinking systemically and acting collaboratively, because these are obviously complicated issues that tap so many different components of our community. This is a focus of the transportation team of REAMP. And you are getting a sneak preview of a report that will be released next week. Again, we're focused on, it's going to be transportation planning for people and the climate, looking specifically at how are municipal and state transportation and climate plans aligned, and who's doing a great job, and what can we learn in terms of ensuring that our climate plans and transportation and land use plans are all well aligned. My name is Megan Owens. I'm the director of Transportation Riders United, a nonprofit advocacy group working in the city of Detroit and across Michigan. We have a great set of panelists for you today, including several folks who are part of the REAMP network, including Ruthie Davis, our researcher who did a whole lot of the work behind the report, who's also studying at Yale, Greg May, Transportation Policy Director at Thousand Friends of Wisconsin, and Carrie Carney, Director of Thousand Friends of Iowa. And then we're also honored to be joined by two municipal planners who will share their community's experience with the very topics in this report, including Sarah Maples from the City of Cedar Rapids and Kathleen Mayall from the City of Minneapolis. So with that, again, this is being recorded, and you can put questions in the Q&A, and I think that is it for my introduction. So I am pleased to pass it over to Ruthie Davis, a researcher from working for the REAMP network. She did a whole lot of excellent work digging into dozens and dozens of transportation and land use plans to get a better understanding of this. So Ruthie, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks so much, Megan. So next slide. As Megan mentioned, the project was set up to look at how planning processes can be leveraged to improve transportation infrastructure in cities across the Midwest. What aligned strategies into local plans was a reciprocal process. It matters both the extent to which cities consider the transportation system when writing their climate plans, and the extent to which comprehensive plans and transportation plans take on and reflect climate goals and climate-aligned strategies. Next slide, please. In order to get a wide range of jurisdictions while still selecting for municipalities that have already passed a climate plan, we reviewed the plans from 25 cities and counties across 5 states: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Michigan, and Illinois. We also looked at state plans when available to provide necessary context. Since not every jurisdiction has all 3 types of plans, we ended up looking at 25 climate plans, 21 comprehensive land use plans, and 22 transportation plans. Next slide, please. So quickly, since our research was focused on just the plans themselves, that is their development and the recommendations therein, not their implementation, there are a few dynamics present in the planning process that are important just to name. First, all 3 types of plans operate without statutory authority. The documents set recommendations and long-term vision, but do not have the power to enact policy. Second, a vast majority of the plans aren't fiscally constrained, which makes them more flexible, but also somewhat less transparent in terms of telling us what a city will follow and implement and what might fall by the wayside. The plans are long range, so they can set the agenda for as much as a decade into the future. And since they're so future facing, they often don't speak of past successes, so we don't always know from the plans themselves what strategy a city has already implemented. Finally, sequencing. A really important dynamic to note is that a city's climate plan isn't necessarily always the starting point for climate-aligned transportation strategies. Frequently, a transportation plan or comprehensive plan will come up for amendment before a climate plan has even been passed. So it's important to keep in mind that no matter what order the documents come in, any city plan has the ability to introduce climate thinking and equitable climate-aligned strategies, and every plan is responsible for looking at their city's own previous plans and for building on or responding to strategies and goals that have already been set. Next slide. So not to go through this all point by point, because we'll get into our findings much more in the next sections, but I just wanted to flash this graph up from our report, which takes a look at how commonly and with what level of detail certain climate-aligned transportation strategies appear in climate plans. So as you can see, all of the climate plans we looked at included a section dedicated to transportation. Almost all included discussion of transit, active transportation, and electrification, but only about half included a level of detail that went beyond "we should improve transit" or such like. About half included goals for vehicle miles traveled or single occupancy vehicle reduction, shared mobility, or smart growth. And at this point, it's also important to note what's not on the graph: strategies such as improving rail, cleaner freight strategies, or stopping highway expansion, which appeared pretty rarely in climate plans and therefore not on this summary graph. Next slide, please. Just to finish my little section up, in a parallel graph for comprehensive and transportation plans, you can see that a majority certainly do include goals around limiting the climate impacts of transportation and land use. Almost all of the plans, even ones that didn't specifically mention it within a climate framework, do include discussions of transit and active transportation. And then the question with those categories should go a step farther and really ask, how far do the strategies go? Will they be implemented within a time frame that befits the urgency of the issue? Are they right for the community, and so on? Just the last note, as you can see, other climate-aligned goals and strategies did appear in a range of transportation and comprehensive plans, but certainly they were not as widespread. I'll pass it back to Megan.
Thank you so much. And we do have an enormous debt to Ruthie for digging into so many different plans and really working to understand what has been incorporated into these various plans. Next up, to talk about some of the policy best practices that came up in these various plans across the Midwest, we have Greg May. He's the Transportation Policy Director for Thousand Friends of Wisconsin and has a lot of experience in long-range comprehensive planning for communities and across several states, especially focused on robust public engagement from housing to bus rapid transit studies. So Greg, tell us about the best practices in the study.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Megan. Hi, everybody. As was mentioned, my name is Greg May. I'm the Transportation Policy Director at 1000 Friends of Wisconsin. We're a member of the REAMP network, and we appreciate all the work that they're doing across the Midwest. This kind of collaboration is really useful for just looking at how communities in our entire region are addressing climate change and transportation. And I also want to thank our partners, Carrie and Megan, Alyssa and Gail, and especially Ruthie, who did a lot of the background research. So if there are folks on this call who need to hire someone down the road, I think she's graduating sometime soon. So 2 thumbs up on hiring her. That research has been invaluable. So my part of the presentation is just talking about some of the policies that we found really commonly in Midwest climate plans and some of our recommendations as a team. So on here, you can see we're talking about EVs, which are was one of the most common features in these climate plans. And we know that they're a part of the solution, but we want to be sure that communities are going beyond them. They are going to reduce emissions, but the time frame on their rollout is slow. They still make up less than 1% of all the vehicles on the road in our country, and they don't solve a lot of the inequalities that are inherent in our transportation system, which this tweet on the right is getting at. So just a recognition that EVs, are going to be a part of your climate plans, but really, try and think more creatively. Transportation is a big, broad category, and don't make them just the cornerstone of everything, because they don't solve a lot of the, air respiratory issues and traffic fatalities that we see. And so anyway, on the next slide, you'll see that we, recommend including a vehicle miles traveled reduction goal. We saw this in some of our goals. We really like it because, especially when they come with specific goals and timeframes, it helps to frame the conversation on usage and efforts to reduce emissions. And so, a couple of communities like Ann Arbor and Cedar Rapids did a good job. We're excited to have someone from Cedar Rapids speaking today, a little later down the road. And then on the next slide, we'll talk about transit. And, that's obviously promoting transit is an excellent tool. And it was probably the most common one we saw on all of these climate action plans across the Midwest. It's effective. It improves equity outcomes. And one of the ones we specifically liked was on the right, you can see from Dubuque, Iowa, which we appreciated because it brought specific timeframes and measures for success with realistic strategies to just improve their transit outcomes. So, when you're thinking about transit in your community, don't just say, we'd like to improve transit. Push yourselves, go a little bit further. Come up with specific timeframes and goals there. On the next slide, we talk about active transportation, which was another incredibly common solution. It's important because half of all trips in 2022 were less than 3 miles. That's according to the U.S. Energy Department. So 3 miles is about a distance that can be walked or biked if conditions are right. So, we recognize that this is a really important strategy, and we were happy to see it in almost all of the plans. And kind of one of the really great examples on the next slide, you'll see from Minneapolis, which is their mode shift goal, which kind of assigned a percentage goal to each mode of travel. And this framed the conversation towards promoting sustainable modes of travel. And we're grateful to have Kathleen Mail from the City of Minneapolis here to speak with us in a bit as well on that effort. So, when you think about active transportation, think about setting specific percentage measurement goals. I think that's been pretty effective in Minneapolis, and hopefully Kathleen will touch on that. The next slide, we talk about shared mobility, which was an opposite. It was talking about like bike shares and car shares in communities, and this was often mentioned, but it was often pretty vague in terms of what that would look like within each community. Just including introducing new or expanding existing options, but was something that was common but didn't have specific measurable goals. So if that's something you're going to include, we're looking for if you've seen one that's good across the Midwest, we'd love to share it with our team, and we'd love to promote one. Because it was often, like I said, as I mentioned, pretty vague. And our next slide, boy, I'm flying through these. And hopefully folks are staying with me. I know I'm just rattling these off, but it's really important. There's so many different goals that can be incorporated into these plans. And some of them, like parking, didn't show up in many plans, given its outsized role in creating ineffective land use and car-centric communities. Here's one from the city of Eau Claire that addressed parking minimums, which our team appreciated. Another one on the next slide is land use, which is obviously important. It can create sustainable growth patterns, and it heavily influences transportation decision making. And again, here's one from Eau Claire that was talking about land use and how they were going to address it. And you'll excuse my Wisconsin bias for using Eau Claire twice. And as I kind of wrap up my speed run here on the last slide, it's important to remember that transportation is a broad and interdisciplinary field, and many plans skipped limiting highway construction, one of the central pillars of our unsustainable and inequitable transportation system. And think about freight, and if some neighborhoods are receiving a disproportionate amount of particulate matter and noise, how that's influencing your community. That was something that wasn't discussed a lot. And remember that the key is to find ways to shift focus to climate aligned strategies like walking, biking, and transit. Avoid an all of the above approach where we're funding everything, including highways. And just a reminder that, you know, what you fund is a direct statement of your community's values. So, you know, what you're funding on your budget is what your community says they want. And so be sure to make it something that's climate aligned with your community's goals. So now I'm going to throw it over to Carrie Carney from 1,000 Friends of Iowa, who's going to talk about some of the process recommendations.
Thank you so much, Greg. As Greg said, I'm Carrie Carney. I'm the Executive Director of 1,000 Friends of Iowa. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the pieces, some of the more process pieces that really make good plans, whether it's a climate action plan, a comprehensive plan, or transportation plan. So one of the key pieces we're going to start with is community engagement and equity. Community engagement and equity are really two of the key components to making a really good plan. Though both of these topics are critically important, we're putting them together because we believe community engagement is the first step towards ensuring equity is at the center of any plan. Next slide, please. So we also acknowledge that this is hard. Rigorous community engagement requires resources and often requires outreach outside of the normal hours and kind of normal methods. When we reviewed these plans, most of them, but not all of them, talked about how they went about community engagement and gathered input and feedback. Most of the plans talked about doing surveys, and that was probably the most common tool that was used. And surveys are really great, and they can work well as long as there's some intentionality around how to engage the most vulnerable residents in the community using the survey tool. So one example, we're going to hear from Sarah Maples from Cedar Rapids shortly, but one example was the City of Cedar Rapids. So they talked about how their first survey, which they received a lot of responses, but they found that the majority of respondents were white, middle to upper class individuals. So they really wanted to target their second survey for vulnerable communities, communities of color, senior citizens, the disabled community. And so they very intentionally reached out to a number of partners, nonprofits, and so forth in the community, and did surveys, set up focus groups so that they really could target communities that otherwise were not being represented in the input. So this is really a critical tool. The City of Minneapolis, who we're also going to hear from here shortly, also had a really good method of partnering with environmental justice organizations. So they created an environmental justice task force to really help engage communities that were left out of the discussion. So they took extra steps to partner with these organizations and really make sure that they got greater community input and engagement as the first step to ensuring the plan meets the needs of those most impacted by climate change. So we really think that this was a great method. Creating surveys in multiple languages, partnering with organizations is a really key strategies to helping to kind of expand your resources in a way that doesn't tap out what you have as a city, but make sure that you're really getting out there to the community and leaving no one behind. Next slide, please. One of the other pieces in here is equity. So most of the plans talked about equity being very important. But one of the things we noticed is that very few of the plans included specific metrics for how they were going to measure equity. So those metrics are really important because what we measure matters. And if we don't have a method for measuring that, we really need to figure out how to build that in. So both Minneapolis and Eau Claire did a good job of mentioning how they were going to use metrics to measure equity and how they were going to weigh things to determine if a project was a good project. We think it's really critical that those metrics are included not just in the planning process, but throughout the implementation process, so that we're really looking at who's benefiting. Are we making sure that we're not adding more harm to communities that are already vulnerable? Who pays the price of this project and so forth, so that we're really making sure that equity and vulnerable communities are prioritized. Next slide, please. So one of the other pieces in the plans that we think is really critical to make good plans is the specificity of the plans. So plans that set very specific goals. So Greg mentioned the city of Dubuque and how they really laid out some very specific goals and steps. The city of Cedar Rapids also did that really well when they were talking about their 15-minute city plan. They had action steps, timelines. So that's really critical. The more specific you can get, the better. VMT, vehicle mile travel reduction goals. A lot of the plans said that they wanted to reduce vehicle miles traveled, but very few of the plans actually had, or I shouldn't say very few, some of the plans had specific goals, but a lot of the plans did not have specific goals for how to reduce vehicle miles traveled, and they didn't have a set, they did not have a set goal like reducing vehicle miles traveled by 40% by such and such a date. So that really strengthens the plan to have those very specific goals and the very specific steps to reach it. Also making these plans, these goals and action steps time bound. When we're going to do it, by when. But also, though it's really important to do that, also making sure we still have flexibility, because we know things change, technologies change all the time. So we want the ability to be flexible while still being accountable on when and how we're doing things. Another thing that really makes the plans stand out is talking about who's responsible. So if we have very specific action steps in terms of transit, it's like, who is it where the buck stops with that person? Who's the person, the office, the agency that's responsible for getting this done? And then again, as I talked about, what we measure matters. So talk about what's getting measured, how we're measuring it. That all makes a difference. When we think about transportation right now, we often are measuring for congestion, how many people are on the roads and so forth, thinking about maybe changing how we measure that to like reach our goals, because what we measure also lines up with what our goals are and what we do. Then the other thing is, most of these plans are not fiscally constrained. Some of the long-range transportation plans are, but generally comprehensive plans and climate action plans are not. But talking a little bit about funding, thinking through where funding will come from, what specific things are going to cost, is going to make the plan more accountable. We don't want to have a plan that's so aspirational, but it doesn't fit in a budget that we can't do it. So make sure that we're putting funding considerations into the plan when we're developing it. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we noticed in the plan for funding considerations is like the state of Michigan in their climate action plan statewide had specific goal funding targets for a percentage of money that was going to be going to equity, and how much that was going to cost. So sequencing of the plans, as Ruthie had mentioned earlier, it's less important on when the plans are created. We know with comprehensive plans, they're usually updated every 10 years. Climate action plans vary from different communities. long-range transportation plans can like look out for 25 years or so. What's really important is that these plans are integrated and they're talking to each other. So for example, communities without a climate action plan, putting those climate goals in your comprehensive plan can work very much like a climate action plan if you have those specific climate goals in there. But for example, like the city of Ames, the city of Cedar Rapids, and the city of Minneapolis all talked about how they were going to go back and update their plans, update their comprehensive plans after they finish their climate action plans. Next slide, please.
I hate to rush it, Carrie, but we are getting short on time. Please wrap up as soon as you can.
Last slide. So integrating those plans is critical. So if you do a climate action plan, go back and update your comprehensive plan and your transportation plan so all the plans reflect the same goals, because there's nothing worse than having a plan that talks about density and active transportation, but then the comprehensive land use plan shows nothing about density or active transportation in the plan. Thank you, and I will wrap it up and turn it back over to you, Megan.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've got so much to get through. And you've got a lot of great information. So as Gail is shifting over to our last two presenters, I want to reiterate, I know there have been some questions. Yes, the recordings and the slides will be available. And possibly more importantly, the whole report that we're putting together will be available. It'll be shared with everyone who registered next week. And I want to take a moment to not only thank Ruthie, who did a lot of the great research, but also thank the GM Climate Equity Fund for not only funding this important research, but also a series of grassroots trainings and planner support that our REAMP organizations were able to do. So we want to look not just at this sampling across the whole region, but we've got two communities who've done some really excellent work that we want to ask to spotlight a little bit of what they've done. So Sarah Maples is the Sustainability Program Manager for the City of Cedar Rapids. Previously, she worked at the University of Iowa's Office of Sustainability. So Sarah, tell us a little bit about your work in aligning climate and transportation plans.
Thank you so much, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really thankful for the opportunity. I am speaking about great work that happened before my time at the city, so I have to sort of give a nod to our city leadership and city staff, and also my predecessor, Eric Holthaus, who really led this initiative. So I will say that our entire plan is available on our website, so I'm going to give such a high level talk about it. If you'd like to take a look, please do. So on the next slide, just to give you a general idea, I'm going to give some background on the framework, the equity piece, and then just dial in a little bit on the land use and transportation. So moving to the next slide, what we work to do is really create a vision following some pretty significant natural events, natural disasters. We had severe flooding in 08 and 16. We had an inland hurricane, the derecho, and our city council declared an urgency for our community to take action on climate in February of 2020. And this built upon some just general concepts of resilience and also reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. So in light of the extreme events that had happened, addressing sort of community resilience to deal with these kinds of stressors, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions community-wide, so not simply looking at the city, but also with industry, and also our transition to clean, renewable energy. And then, of course, these really two key resilience pieces, ensuring equitable health and prosperity for all of our residents, in either economically, through healthy food, access to our parks, and also clean air and water. And also, we tried to prioritize the residents with the greatest vulnerabilities within the planning process. So This resolution, thank you, really jump-started an 18-month planning process. There was a kickoff event, there were 2 public surveys, and also focus groups. And what we really tried to do is create a vision for our community within these 2 main buckets, the carbon-free goal and then also the resilience goal. As it was mentioned before, in order to get feedback from a true representation of our community, in the second public survey, city staff went in person to get survey input from our residents. So within the second survey, 28% of the respondents were non-white and 29% were low income, which is less than $25,000 a year. Certain things that came out to be highlighted, healthy food access, energy efficient homes, and tree replacement really rose to the top. We also, I should mention, had a community climate advisory committee. So this was representatives from NGOs, environmental groups, businesses, and government. So moving to the next slide, talking a little bit more about the equity piece. The CDC's Social Vulnerability Index was one key piece we used when determining locations of vulnerability. And looking sort of in addition to the socioeconomic status piece of income and poverty and education, but also age and possible language barriers, and then housing types. So what we did is we found some core neighborhoods, and so that was a big focus of our efforts. So moving to the next slide. Really honing in on these land use and transportation goals, we had in the plan goals, targets, and then actions. There's 24 actions total. We're looking here at 4 that really focused in on land use and transportation. There's a big focus in our community development department looking at missing middle housing and providing additional opportunities for that. Creating a sustainable development policy that defines the characteristics of a 15-minute neighborhood. So this is a common term that we hear in planning, but for us, what does that mean? And so we're working to develop that guidance, and again, prioritizing vulnerable neighborhoods. We're working to enhance the transit and shared transportation in under-resourced communities and sort of trying to prioritize these key areas. And then the complete streets policy, so not defaulting, as was mentioned before, to vehicles, but trying to see if we can both address urban heat island mitigation with tree plantings, and also in the way that we plan our city. So I'm going to go through maybe 3 things that we've done post planning, just to kind of highlight how this is translated. So on the next slide, one big change that happened were with accessory dwelling units, or also known as granny flats. The community development department was successful in expanding the code in order to allow for all different types of ADUs. And the great thing about the solutions is that it helps with our resilience piece, it helps with our age-friendly action plan, but also it helps with our density and our carbon reduction goals. So that's been pretty significant for us. On the next slide, we do have some, our contractor VO provides some transportation options. So we do have a robust transit system, but we are a Midwest city. We don't have a metro. So we are trying to provide additional alternatives that are less expensive than owning a car. And this, of course, supports both our environmental and equity goals. There's some more programming we're looking at for this to try and encourage more e-bike usage and bike usage throughout the community. So we're still moving forward on that. I will say, I guess, a couple of things also in terms of giving EVs, although we've been trying to focus on e-bikes and sort of these micro-mobility options, our corridor MPO funded a transit EV transition plan. So we had a big goal in the plan, but then we kind of need help getting from point A to point B. We also have a fleet transition plan in process. So on my last slide, I will kind of mention our relief program. So following the derecho, we lost over 500,000 trees, an incredible loss, 2/3 of our tree canopy. And so rebuilding that has been a really important piece, but also the way that we talk about it. So yes, we talk about it in terms of just replanting and the beautification of the city, but also which, we prioritize native trees. We look at certain areas where heat reduction would be a priority, or in under-resourced neighborhoods where maybe the tree canopy is even less. And there was a tree equity score that was used when planting. And so this looks at things like equity, canopy coverage, and climate. And so far, the first year, there's been a number of challenges as always, but we've been really successful in actually planting quite a number of trees to meet our first goal. Our Parks and Rec department leads this, but they also have something called Roland Recmobile. So in terms of our 15-minute neighborhoods, this is an opportunity for recreation to actually meet people where they're at and actually travel to the various parks, so that is a more equitable piece as well. And with that, I don't want to take up any more time, but I will be glad to answer questions at the end.
Wonderful. I really appreciate those examples, both of how you developed it as well as what was developed. And our final speaker before we get into some questions and discussion, Kathleen Mayel, who's the Transportation Planning Manager at the City of Minneapolis. Yeah, I'll just pass it off to you.
Thanks so much. Nice to be here with you all, and let's get started. So I'm going to speak to our recent transportation policy framework, which shout out to our Director of Sustainability who's on the call right now. I mean, this is a transportation plan, but it very much is grounded, and I think of it often as like it's also a climate plan. So very much, I think when you can integrate your thinking around the two, you're going to achieve stronger results. So if you can go to the next slide, please. So we based our work in our comprehensive plan, which is called Minneapolis 2040. And what was really, from a process standpoint, what works really well with that is we didn't need to debate what we were planning to accomplish. We just needed to outline how we were going to do it. And that's what we did with our transportation action plan. So our Minneapolis 2040 is a 20-year vision, transportation action plan, 10 years. How are we going to get to a multimodal network to prioritize walking, biking, and transit? Next slide, please. And we really base this in a lot of policy work. So again, I think that nesting and building on existing policy work is super important. Our complete streets policy, our climate action plan, the Vision Zero commitment to ending fatalities was not fiscally constrained. I found the slides that went through earlier about kind of like what resonated across multiple plans, really interesting. A couple other things we did is there's a lot of things we wanted to say, like, we support, but we know we're not the primary actors and we can't really tell somebody else what to do. So we identified each action within our plan as either a do action or a support action. Next slide, please. We started this work, it took a while, and we spent time, we purposely wanted the comprehensive plan to be completed first. We did a lot of different engagement, listening sessions, focus groups, community contracts with neighborhood-based organizations. Next slide, please. When we passed the plan in December of 2020, it had been years at that point. We had a number of different advisory committees ranging from our elected officials to department leadership across 16, not all 16 departments at the city were represented. We had our interagency support as well. So things like our transit agency or the county or state departments of transportation. And then we had really like staff level working groups on all different topic areas. If you can go to the next, please. In terms of engagement, I like what was said earlier too, in terms of really getting in and using engagement as a tool and building from a foundation. We took all the work that was done with the comprehensive plan and took that as our starting point and said, we heard you, community. We don't need to re-ask the same questions. So we really were able to focus in a bit more, again, getting on the how are we going to do what we set out to do, not what are we going to do. And we were, producing engagement summaries and so on to be able to share kind of how we keep moving forward in the process. Next slide, please. We also released our draft plan a week before we were sent home for COVID, and then our comment period we extended to 3 days before George Floyd was murdered on a Minneapolis street. So there was a lot happening in Minneapolis during that time, and I think it just speaks to like you need to be very much what the past presenter was talking about, like you're in a place in a time and you have to react to that. So we certainly took a deeper dive and spent longer going from draft to final, because we really refocused on like, is this plan doing everything it can for streets in Minneapolis right now? And one of the major things, we did additional engagement with groups that were working on equity, racial equity work, and we added 3 new strategies to our plan that really focused on racial equity, evaluation of our work, and engagement. Next slide, please. The goals had from the beginning included climate, equity, safety, and so on here. And if you can flip to the next slide. And we were really clear that we wanted to reshape the transportation system to address climate change and aggressively reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So we could keep coming back to these goals, and these were passed through council as kind of like a first step of our process. So that was helpful. If you can go to the next slide, please. And really, I think because we're all on this call together, I think we know, as professionals and others, why to prioritize climate, but really calling out some of those statistics. We were pegging our greenhouse gas emissions reductions to our then climate action plan reduction goal of 80% reduction by 2050. And we fully anticipate to readjust once our climate action plan, which is currently being updated, goes to 100% reduction. And that will only make our transportation plan stronger as we, adjust our targets toward that. Next slide, please. We also were clear in terms of linking climate and equity, looking at the historical context, the freeways, the interstates, bifurcation of neighborhoods, concentrated emissions, and calling out that link, which our comp plan had done as well in terms of the redlining and where we had concentrated poverty, all that. So, Minneapolis ranks really low nationally in terms of our different outcomes based on race. And so it was an important part to highlight and make the connection to transportation as well within our plan. Next slide, please. So we, for the first time in the city's planning work, we kind of combined all of our different topic areas under one plan. Previously, we'd had a PED plan and a bike master plan and so on. And we added in some new elements as well. Transit, for the first time, we're not the transit agency, but we have a really big influence in how well transit works in our city, based on how our streets are designed. We looked at technology, freight, street operations, how everything comes together, and so on. If you can go to the next slide, please. Every action we put down a time frame for and noted if they were ongoing or kind of one and done. And we committed to reporting back every 2 years of this 10-year plan on the actions, and we just did that in December. Next slide, please. We created 4 different priority networks, which have really helped guide how we invest in our programs in the city. All Ages and Abilities is our bicycle network, and micromobility. Next slide, please. This was already shown, which is awesome. So I think that in terms of like what policies have been super effective in terms of how they guide our work or kind of direct conversations, this mode shift goal has been really important when we talk about street design and decisions that are being made and operations on our street, is that we need to be planning for the future that we want and that we are designing for. So this has been this is the first time the city set a mode shift goal like this, like citywide, and it's been a super important piece of this work. Next slide. There's 2 others, the greenhouse gas reduction. We did this in line again with our climate action plan, and we'll adapt as we move forward. Next slide. And then we linked our VMT reduction goals toward that greenhouse gas reduction goal. And to a question that was noted in the chat, we both said 500 million less vehicle miles traveled a year by 2030 which means accounting for anticipated growth and so on of population, on average 4 miles less per person per day, which seems like something tangible. And so we thought it was important to put both of those and give it kind of a focus on a person level. Next slide, please. We also put in there a goal of transit proximity in terms of how many people can get within a 5 or 10 minute walk of high frequency transit. Next slide, please. And since we passed the plan in December 2020, we've been able to produce a companion street design guide that really embodies kind of the policy framework of our plan in terms of how we design our streets. We've updated our complete streets policy to include freight and micromobility and green infrastructure. We've updated our ADA transition plan. And then we just released in December a draft racial equity framework for transportation, which really builds off those new progress strategies that we included over the summer of 2020. So that is out, well, just the public comment period just closed. And there's an accompanying dashboard with a lot of data and how this all ties together. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple snapshots of how we see our policy and our plans show up in the real world. So separated bike trails, additional green infrastructure, neighborhood traffic calming, transit priority lanes. If you can go to the next slide, please. Click again. I think there just might be a series. This is more green infrastructure that we have really been putting more into our project and looking at these transportation projects as a way to increase green space, lower average land temperature and so on, and capture stormwater. Next slide, please. We've been working on a car share program, mobility hubs. That's the picture on the right. Next slide, please. And then a lot of quick build projects as well, aligned with our Vision Zero program. So using paint and bollards while we work toward more permanent solutions, as well as looking at our 4-lane undivided streets, which are most dangerous in the city, and converting to 4 to 3 or 4 to 2s, which is the bottom before and after. Next slide, please. That is it. Yeah, thank you all, and happy to be part of the discussion that follows.
Excellent. Well, what a excellent set of information. So much, a little bit of a drinking from a fire hose with all these excellent examples. But as I mentioned before, our report will come out next week. We will share the recording and the slides so people can get into a little more depth. And over these last 9 minutes, we want to take some questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A. And I would say one of the first questions, one question that came up a number of times, that a lot of the examples that we use seem to be from bigger cities and college towns. Do we have any examples from rural or more suburban communities, especially noting a planner who was directed by a suburban community to remove the words climate change from a comprehensive plan? So any suggestions for working in more rural or suburban? And actually, perhaps all of our panelists can come on screen.
Yeah,
can come on camera, and we can. Yeah, Carrie, please go ahead.
Take a first stab at that. So I think the smallest community we looked at was Decorah, Iowa, which has a population under 8,000. So it's actually a really good example of a climate action plan for a small community. But with that said, we're also familiar here in Iowa. We've seen communities who have the same struggle. Folks don't like to talk about climate change. So we really think about it doesn't matter what words you use, as long as it's still doing the same. There's a community right now in central Iowa that is developing a sustainability plan, which is essentially a climate action plan. But I think no matter how you look at it, the goals that you put into a climate action plan, even if you don't talk about climate, really help with communities on how to thrive, improve quality of life and so forth. So I think that there's definitely ways around talking about climate change, though it does make it easier if you can measure greenhouse gas emissions. there's definitely ways to work around it. And I don't know if other folks have more to say on that.
Excellent. Yeah, I do. I have definitely seen some good examples of recognizing some of the other values, affordability, sustainability, walkability, some of these other components. Anyone else want to comment on? All right, we'll keep moving. Related to that, any suggestions, whether language, info, or policies for convincing counties to rein in willy-nilly rural development, which increase reliance on private vehicles and make transit harder? A regional hub town or city may develop a community action plan, but surrounding rural areas may not buy in. So related, but anyone want to build on that?
I was waiting for you to jump in, Greg.
Definitely a challenge, but yes, go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, it definitely is a challenge. And one of the things that, obviously one of the things that our organization does is that we are working with folks in rural areas who are really working to preserve farmland and show that farmland is development. But I also think like working within your COG or your MPO can help a lot in getting more of a holistic vision for the area. One of the things I think we've seen here in Iowa, and I hope I'm not going to offend anybody, is that there's always this push to, hey, if we build this new highway, we're going to get more development along the way. And we've seen, like when Highway 5 was constructed to attract development, it didn't actually happen. And then we've now built like the Veterans Parkway, and there's a little bit of development, but not a lot. And now there's a push to turn Highway 5 into an interstate to attract development. And it really, more roads isn't really the answer, but really thinking about like the quality of life in communities. And I always love Dubuque as an example. This is a city that focused on sustainability that's totally changed the whole fabric of that community. 20 years ago, Dubuque, I think, had a lot of struggles and challenges, unemployment and so forth, and it's now one of the most vibrant communities in Iowa, and that happened because it focused on sustainability.
Excellent. Another related question, a community that's very dependent on the highway that runs through it, that's heavily used by semi-trucks, logging trucks. Any tips for reducing the impact of those types of vehicles when they do feel necessary? Anyone have feedback there?
I don't work in a community like that, but I did used to work for the State Department of Transportation. And I think it's just really important to put in balance the fact that, yes, obviously Main Street is often a state highway or what have you that has that type of traffic, and you need to right size the state highway for the environment. There are people walking across that street. They are, so it's like, you don't need to apologize for having a town along a highway, right? Or a city. It's an important piece. And obviously you need those semi trucks and logging trucks to come through and whatnot. So it's about, design decisions that can really manage speed and manage access across the street, and let people driving those vehicles know that there are people that are not in those vehicles, right? And how do you make that happen in real time? It's hard, right?
That's a great point. I have seen some interesting discussion about ensuring that the people who are living and working and shopping in that downtown community have as much, if not more, rights to that road than the vehicles that are zooming through it. So recognizing that there's a wide variety of different users of a transportation area, of a roadway and a transportation area, and I like that point, balancing a lot of those different needs. The other suggestion I've seen is to sometimes think about the most vulnerable populations, and no one's going to really argue against taking care of our seniors and ensuring that seniors or people with disabilities have the space and time that they need to travel through our community. Amanda had a question about promoting the accessory dwelling unit, a little specific, but Dubuque has one, and not many people know about it. How are good policies like that, once they're developed, how are they promoted to make sure that people can take advantage of them?
I would share a couple things that our community development department's done. One is they had a ADU gingerbread contest. So they had people pick up kits at the local library, and then they would put them together, post their photos, and then they were judged and we gave out gift cards. So that was a really fun way, I think, of promoting it. The community development department has also hosted informational sessions at the library, usually in partnership with AARP. So
I love that example. I love that example. We've got just 2 more minutes. I wanted to see, I believe Elizabeth Burke had a hand up. Did you want to ask a question, Ms. Burke, or was that from earlier?
Sorry, that was an accident.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Then one last question. In terms of evaluating roadway projects, level of service is the traditional measurement, but has often had bad outcomes for climate. What alternatives have you used in evaluating designing roadway projects to look at more than just vehicle flow, level of service? Anyone want to share some feedback on that?
I'll note that we had a lot of discussion about level of service when we were developing our plan, and we put 2 different actions in our plan, walking 2.7, which I can throw in the chat, about discontinuing the use of vehicular level of service and or vehicle counts as the sole justification, and so on. And I think it's important to just name what it is you're trying to do. And so we did that, and it's been helpful. And then there's another one that speaks to, except where necessary to meet funding, legislative or other jurisdictional requirements. But there's plenty of street projects we do in Minneapolis that don't have those. And so how do we really think about what are our values and what we design, how our values showing up in our streets? So, it's a work in progress. I won't say it's perfect, but it certainly has been important to be able to point to some of those actions and say, like, this is what we think about vehicle level of service. And those are the 2 mentions of it out of 325 actions in our plan.
Excellent.
Go
ahead, Ruthie. Did you want to add something?
Just a little adding to that is, like, Minneapolis is such a great example of a place that also, I think, uses a complete streets hierarchy, right? Where vehicle level of service can be framed within a really robust hierarchy of prioritizing other street users. So that it's not the main metric that says how well our streets are working. So that can be a really useful metric to add in, would be the complete streets hierarchy. And also sometimes you see pedestrian or bicycle level of service or transit level of service in addition to just straight vehicle level of service.
Well, this is such a huge topic. We could go on for a long, long time. We are at our 60 minutes. I will ask if folks have to hop off, understood. But if our speakers want to make any closing remarks, if you've got maybe 30 seconds of closing remarks and then of course we will be sending the report out as well as everyone's contact information so that this discussion does not need to end. But Ruthie, do you want to share any closing remarks followed by Greg?
No, really, just thank you all so much for coming.
All right, thank you.
Excited.
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone who's involved in this and our speakers for joining us today, and to let everyone know on this call that we're out here to be a resource, and so reach out to us if you have other questions. We're happy to direct you in the right directions if you're in your community making a plan right now.
Excellent. Yeah, there are a lot of really good examples. No one needs to reinvent the wheel when you've got lots of good examples to build from in this very, very important topic. Carrie?
Yeah, I would say, just building on that, if people have specific items that they'd like to dig in on, any of the best practices, how communities are doing them, and so forth, let us know that as well, because we are planning future webinars to really help communities think through how to do some of these things. So let us know. And thank you, everybody, for participating, and for our great speakers. We appreciate it.
And Sarah, and then Kathleen, any closing remarks or suggestions?
I want to say thank you. It's been a great learning opportunity for me as well. And I have some tidbits that I'm going to take back and use. So thank you for that. And it's been a pleasure. So, and of course, I'm a resource if anyone wants to learn more about the Cedar Rapids plan.
I'll just echo Sarah. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and happy to follow up with anyone. My contact info is on the slides that'll get sent around. If a question
Excellent.
didn't get answered or something, thank you.
So a huge thank you to all of our speakers, to the REAMP network, and Gail Francis, who manages our transportation team, to Ruthie Davis for a lot of this good research, and to the GM Climate Equity Fund for supporting the research, the trainings, and the community support. So watch for that, the slides and the contact info. Thank you very much for your attention to this really important issue. It's going to take everyone working together to improve transportation and climate across the Midwest, but we can make a difference when with 80 some people all working together to make it happen just today. So thanks so much and have a wonderful day.